All right, we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Katie Clark, and I'm here on behalf of the California and Northwest chapters of the Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museum. We are delighted that so many of you are here with us today. Just a couple quick technical reminders before we get started. So because this is a webinar, your camera and sound is off. That means we can't see you or hear you, but if you have a question or a comment, please do type it in that Q&A box anytime. You should see that option at the top or the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties, one of our producers will be on hand to assist you throughout the talk. And if you've got a question for Liz, go ahead and drop that in the Q&A box anytime, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the talk. And now it's my very great pleasure to welcome for the second lecture in our series, the absolutely stellar Liz Lev. She is well known to all of you patrons, of course, and to those of you who are joining us who haven't had the opportunity to hear her before. I can guarantee that you are in for a treat today. So please welcome Liz. And Liz, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me back again, and greetings from a very rainy Rome on May 1st, which is a national holiday for us. It's the feast of St. Joseph the Worker. So it is very much my pleasure to bring part 2 of this story of the Grand Tour and really understanding a period in Roman history which has been neglected by a great many scholars, and yet is critical not only for our modern age, but for the history of our beloved Vatican Museums. And so I'm going to be taking us a step further today in the Grand Tour. We're going to move a little bit further along in our story of the Grand Tour, and we're going to get a little bit of a sense of what it is that people saw when they actually got to the city of Rome. So let's get started with the Grand Tour Part 2. So we're going to start out with, like last week, I talked to you a lot about the transportation. So how did people get to Rome? Something that's reflected in the fascinating yet underappreciated carriage museum in the Vatican Museum. Now I'd like to take you to the very end of that journey. You're in the stage court. You've come to the very end of this last long length of drawing. And finally, the coach stops and you look outside. And this was your first view. Your first image of Rome up until the 1800s, up until the advent of trains, 90% of visitors who came to Rome approached from the northern gate. And they saw this, the famous Porta del Popolo, the Porta Flaminia, which comes at the end of the Via Flaminia. They didn't exactly see people wearing masks, but we'll use our imaginations. And you would walk through, you would alight from your carriage, or perhaps your carriage would take you through, and your very first impact, your very first view of the city of Rome was this amazing piazza, a task that had been, this is a piazza that was 1,500 years in the making. The Romans are the ones who had put this opening in the walls. And then it was Pope Sixtus V who in 1585 put the obelisk that you see there to help tourists find their way, or to help the pilgrims find their way through the city. To the left, there's the church of Santa Maria del Popolo, built by Pope Sixtus IV. But the new transformation at the end of the 17th century was the construction of those two lovely churches, the twin churches you see at the very back, which would anchor what was called the Trident. And it was a very easy way for people to find their way because there were 3 simple streets. So you would get off your carriage, and there it was, the city of Rome at your feet. 3 directions. Which one would you take? Well, much would actually depend on your lodging. Where is it that you're planning to stay? And it's interesting to see that there were many different solutions for lodging in Rome. And we'll just go through a few of them quickly for curiosity's sake. If you were an aristocrat, from France, from Sweden, from England, you probably had some kind of connection with noble families. And so noble families would open up their homes to you. The Odescalchi family, which you see in the lower left-hand corner, is famous for hosting people. And the Doria Pamphili Palace actually built a whole new wing so as to be able to accommodate all the visitors that would come and stay with them. I have a fun little recent, it's a fun fact about the Palazzo Odescalchi. The Palazzo Odescalchi has since been broken up into a lot of different apartments, and that goes back to the tradition of people staying in that palace. But there was a huge scandal, I think it was about 5 years ago, that the Odescalchi family was selling bits of this property, which is literally next to Piazza Venezia, for something like 4,500 euro per square meter, when everywhere else is something like 14,000 per square meter. So that's kind of the big scandal in Rome of the past decade. You can also visit, it's kind of a proto Airbnb, and these were rented apartments. And as a matter of fact, a lot of developers in Rome began to build these kinds of apartments. So the idea of the modern apartment comes to Rome during the Grand Tour. As a matter of fact, this beautiful building on the right, the one that you probably know very well, it's in front of the Church of Sant'Ignazio, designed by Filippo Ranguzzini in the 1730s. Very, very picturesque. Every single building of the 3 buildings that make up that piazza was built as an apartment. This is a brand new idea in constructing, and many nobles would purchase apartments, or wealthy people would purchase apartments so as to be able to rent them out to the grand tours. So it became a kind of a budding economy. And then on the left, you have the palace, or the building, or literally the house that was rented by Keats and Shelley during their time in Rome. So it's just kind of an interesting solution. But for people like me, the artists, the art historians, the students, we stayed in the Camere Locande, which apparently, because Rome had such a long tradition of hospitality, remember, long before the grand tourists, Rome has been putting up pilgrims. So there really was a tradition of how to put people up, and the awareness that, we get people in Rome and they need a place to stay. And the Camere Locande are kind of like bed and breakfasts, or what you would call in Italy a pensione. It was a much less expensive option. You would rent a room in an apartment building or in a palace. You got room and board, so you would be fed your meals during the day. You would have a laundry service, which is wonderful. And artists really found this an ideal solution for them. It was a very good way of living in Rome. Now, they weren't all perfect, these locande, camere locande. Some of them could be really quite distressing. And artists loved to describe what their rooms looked like. So it's really fun, because when you read the artists talking about their experience in Rome, they will inevitably leave a written, a verbal, or sort of a literary description of their room as if they were painting, except for the fact that they usually don't like their rooms very much. So in the case of Thomas Jones in 1776, on the walls hung dusty, macabre paintings, weeping Magdalens, blood-soaked Ecce Homo, fainting Madonnas. In this depressing room, or should I say chapel, I retired every night. So we have this sort of vision of sort of stuck, and you can imagine a room in a palace which has gotten very old and hasn't been made lively. But what's really interesting about this? This is a fun fact that has nothing to do with anything. But the fact of the matter is, this painting, right? So one of the most famous Van Gogh paintings, it's the same tradition. What Van Gogh is doing is what artists have done from time immemorial. One of the first things they like to paint or describe is the room where they're staying, which I thought was kind of a neat little touch. And then the fact is that people in the know would tell you sometimes these Roman beds were a little questionable. As a matter of fact, in Thomas Jones' description, you have this kind of sack of straw sitting on some pieces of iron. And particularly during the period when you were traveling, so spending nights in the osterie on your way to Italy, it actually became part of the recommended luggage for the grand tourists to make sure that they had a portable bed. And this is just a really cool way of showing how you could have a bed that was placed inside a suitcase. And if you could not afford a bed, if you didn't carry one of those beds, every single grand tourist said, make sure you bring your own sheets. And the other thing that they would often suggest is to make sure you bring a lock, because the doors were famously without locks. And so they would tell you where to go, which hardware store to go to have a special lock made that would fit on every door. These were the concerns that the grand tourists had. And then along came hotels. And hotels really play a key role. And in Rome, actually, back up for a second, show you this again. In Rome, the oldest hotel, we know the oldest hotel in Rome, it's right by the Pantheon. It's called Sole al Pantheon, Albergo Sole al Pantheon. So there's the Pantheon, and there's the hotel over there on the left. That's where Ariosto stayed. He actually dined with Leo X, the Pope, during his stay in Rome. So we have this very famous hotel that is still there. We can see how it changes over the years. The piazza changes in the 1600s. They put in a big fountain, but there's the Albergo del Sole. And actually it's still there today, although it's very unprepossessing. And unfortunately, there was a big pile of garbage outside when I went to take a picture. But hotels became a kind of guarantee of service. The standardization of hotels, the idea of a place where you could go and know that the service and you would have a certain kind of hospitality, really becomes a game changer in the 19th century. So in the 1700s, there aren't very many hotels, but a few really brilliant enterprising families will start building hotels. And by 1800s, we start to see very important hotels. So the Grand Hotel de la Minerva, which is right around the corner from Albergo Sole al Pantheon, is a hotel that was built in the 1600s. And it was by a very kind of enterprising French family that purchased the palace and decided to turn it into a place to stay. And then along come the Torlonias. And I've been talking to you a lot about the Torlonias. I was talking about their collection in the Villa Albani last week. The Torlonias, part of their tremendous success is very, very early on. So basically in 1810, they begin to realize that the number of people coming to Rome and the kinds of people who are coming to Rome are going to need a guarantee of a place to stay, a place where they can socialize, be together, a landing point. And so they built intentionally, and the Torlonia family intentionally built right in the Piazza del Popolo. So you can see that back in 1800, along with the very first thing you saw when you came into the Piazza del Popolo was what would be called the Grand Hôtel des Russes et des Îles Britanniques, because the story of the naming of this hotel is long and complicated. But they built this very beautiful hotel, which of course is still in Rome today. And then the Torlonias, realizing that there was still room for more, built a second hotel right across the street from their actual palace. And they built the hotel that you know today as the Hotel d'Inghilterra. So these two hotels date back to early 1800s. And it's part of the Torlonia's family, very, very clever entrepreneurial understanding that these very special visitors would require very special services. Well, after that, there was the problem of dining. And there's always a little bit of a crisis with some of the visitors to Rome regarding food. The British, who were kind of used to eating basically a lot of meat, so some beef and mutton, were a little confused by the Italians, who did not eat quite as much meat. But one thing they found some sort of pleasure in was the discovery of macaroni, which you and I now would call pasta. And this is described by Goethe. He gives us a very beautiful description of the pasta that people eat in Rome. They're very finely ground flour, cut into long shapes. So they were usually cut to be like spaghetti. They were cooked in water, then covered with cheese or something else in order to give it a little bit of flavor. So we have Goethe, who waxes romantic about how wonderful the Italian, or how good the Italian pasta is. Very, very, very cheap. It's a great way to eat, inexpensive. Well, that's one thing. The other part was, how do you eat the pasta? Because I think anyone who's been faced with a plate of bucatini alla matriciana has asked him or herself, now what do I do? Well, we have an anonymous Irish visitor from the Grand Tour who watches the Neapolitans eating the pasta in horror, saying that they grabbed it with their fingers, pulling it and twisting it, and then sticking it voraciously in their mouths, magnanimously disdaining forks, knives, or spoons, or any other instrument except that which nature had kindly put at their disposal. The other thing you see here is wine. The Grand Tourists enjoyed the fact that there was copious wine. But the fact is that the wine produced in southern Italy is very, very, very strong. So they would almost always cut it with water in order to create something more, so you didn't get drunk before you finished your first course. And then another kind of fun little note was sometimes they used flavors that were much more connected to ancient Rome. So these kind of mixes of sweets and sours. There was a dish of wild rabbit cooked in a chocolate sauce with pine nuts and little prosciutto cubes, which I'm not entirely sure I would eat. And then, of course, there was the moment that the Grand Tourists wanted a little reminder of home, wanted something that they were more familiar with, coffee, tea, for example. So these coffee houses and eventually tea houses would open in Rome, and these become incredible magnets for the Grand Tourists. So the oldest one we have in Rome, the oldest public coffee house, opened in the 1760s, is the Antico Caffè Greco, where the most well-known Grand Tourists were known to go visit. And then there was another one very close to the Antico Caffè Greco, which has been unfortunately turned into a Chanel boutique, but it was called the Caffè di Inglesi, and it had a very, very, very special feature in that the cafe was decorated by the artist Piranesi. So it's kind of like going to some really cool French cafe and having decorations by Miro or Picasso on the walls. That was what you had in this Caffè di Inglesi, again, a major haunt for the great writers and artists, where the entire space had been decorated by Giovanni Battista Piranesi and his sons. So these very, very nice places to kind of go meet people. People wrote entire novels there. We still have this in Rome. One is called the Beehive. That's where we go to get bagels, and Home Baked, which is where we go to get pancakes. So I can completely relate to the life of the Grand Greco, the Caffè Greco. But now we get to really the most important part, which is, what did you do once you were here? And of course, the most important reason that these Grand Tourists were here was the experience of ancient Rome. But it didn't look like the forum that you and I see today. It looked like this. It was known as the cow pasture at the time. And the few little, this is part of the Temple of Castor and Pollux. So you're looking directly into the forum. Over here in the back, that's what you would know today as the Capitoline Museums. It actually was the Capitoline Museums back then. This is the Temple of Saturn. And then there's a whole series of medieval buildings here. There's the column of focus, and then hidden from view is the Arch of Septimius Severus. And then this was a giant watering fountain where people went and watered their livestock in the middle of the forum. So the forum really had a sense of a place that had been abandoned, even more so the Coliseum. This is an image of the Coliseum done before the Coliseum was restored, which took place in 1815, more or less. And it was on top of that, the Coliseum had been sort of, the Coliseum would be rededicated in the 18th century as a martyrium, as a specifically religious site. So at the exact same time the Grand Tourists are showing up and Byron is going around at night and writing his poetry, is the exact same time that we see the Stations of the Cross inserted into the Colosseum, chapels built into the Colosseum. Benedict Labre, the patron saint of homeless people, is living in the Colosseum. You can actually see that kind of memory of this sacred place that had really become part of the sacred history of Rome in memory of the Christian martyrs by these little crosses that are placed up at the top. This painting and the previous painting are both very significant in how the Grand Tourists remembered their their trip. You and I would take a cell phone camera and post something on Instagram, but how do you do that in an age before cameras? And so you needed one of the most important services rendered to the grand tourists were these artists, these very gifted artists who could capture the likeness of a space. And so literally this man, Bernardo Bellotto, was perhaps he was a relative of Canaletto, if any of you are acquainted with the famous Venetian vedutista. Canaletto did in Venice what Bernardo Bellotto does in Rome. And as a matter of fact, Bernardo Bellotto studied under Canaletto, and he came to Rome and became a specialist in creating these views. So instead of, a camera, you would have the view of the forum that you wanted, or the view of something of Rome that you wanted, and you brought it home as your picture. The Coliseum is another example. This is my favorite of the Vedutisti. As a matter of fact, it's his painting that I put in back of me today. His name is Hubert Robert. He spent most of his life here painting in Rome. And if you hired Hubert Robert, he was going to give you a little bit more than just a snapshot of the forum. He was the artist who used the ancient ruins to evoke kind of exciting moments. He was the one who tried to give you the sense of discovery and adventure as you were finding these monuments, as you were exploring this forgotten world. And so this is one of my favorite paintings. It's in the Richmond Art Museum. It's the finding of the Laocoon, which famously took place in 1506. So this, this amazing statue lost in this hall as the peasants are running around doing their daily business. Very, very romantic notion of the finding of art. As a matter of fact, if you're interested, at LACMA, you have a Hubert Robert also, which is the stairs and fountain of a Roman villa. And of course, he also did a portrait of one of my favorite places slightly outside of Rome called Capirola. So he was kind of a great, very, very, very popular painter. The other artist is Piranesi. Piranesi was, Giovanni Battista Piranesi was an engraver, and a really magnificent engraver. He is one of the greatest engravers of all time. And these two images, I had taken one that was supposed to be the Mausoleum of St. Helena, just so you could see the beautiful workmanship. You can see the fine, fine, fine details of this man's drawing. He was an extraordinary draftsman, but he was also very imaginative. And so what you would get if you went to Piranesi is the use of ancient monuments mixed in the most fantastic ways. And both of these works are actually they're both in Los Angeles. And the one that I think is really, this is a sort of a fantastic work of a sawmill inside some sort of Roman substructure. And the other one on the right, which is just beautiful, is the light that falls on the canopy of St. Peter's during the ceremonies on Good Friday. So he captures that evocative moment of the Good Friday ceremonies, which actually back in the day involved taking a candle out and bringing the candle in. So he's giving us the sense of the return of the light. Anyway, I think these are really, really beautiful works. These were precious works, and these were things that you brought home with you and you poured over, and you brought back the memory of that precious voyage through these extraordinarily beautiful works. And then, of course, if you were the Comte de Stenville, when you could afford anything, you would hire Giovanni Paolo Panini to get every possible monument you wanted all in one. This is the ultimate, it's a brand new type of portraiture, brilliant innovation by Panini, where he creates an imaginary gallery. So basically, he's a genius perspective artist. He can work in perspective in any way. And so he creates this immense space where paintings are hanging all over the space of all the most famous monuments in ancient Rome. So this is the catalog of what the grand tourists are going to see. These are the three pieces of the Temple of Titus and Vespasian, the little pieces sticking out of the top from the Arch of Septimius Severus, the Coliseum post-restoration, all of these different elements of Rome all placed together, plus a portrait, because we have here standing, looking over this incredible gallery is the Comte de Stenville, and behind him is Giovanni Paolo Panini, kind of looking over his handiwork. So what an amazing thing. And then you could get the modern version. It was a pendant painting where you would have ancient Rome on one side and modern Rome on the other side. Two of these paintings, by the way, are in the Met Museum in New York. So if you ever happen to get to New York, make sure you go to the Met and see them, because they're right next to each other as they would have been, and they are an utter delight to look at. And modern Rome, of course, shows the Rome of Michelangelo, the Rome of Bernini, the Rome of the 18th century, which we are about to talk about. And then we also had the production of portraits. So the grand tourists love to sit for portraits. And as I said yesterday, as I said last week, this portrait is one of the most important ones. It's actually the one that cemented the painter from Lucca, Pompeo Battoni, as the portrait artist of the Grand Tour. And it was painted in 1758 when 22-year-old Sir Wyndham Knatchbull Wyndham took his Grand Tour immediately after finishing university. And he met a very young Pompeo Battoni and ordered a full-length portrait. Interestingly enough, this work is so incredibly important, and yet when the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. was offered it, they passed on it. And that is how you ended up with it in Los Angeles, which is a great treasure. What you see is a kind of a mix between the neoclassical and the Baroque. So you can already sort of feel that kind of stiffening of the figure, which will be a hallmark of the neoclassical. But the big kind of curtain in the corner and the grand gesture is very Baroque. He's wearing an outfit that he would never have been wearing in the Grand Tour. It's almost like he's wearing like a period costume, because that's not what the clothing of 1750 was. This is a clothing from an earlier period, like in the paintings of Van Dyck. They loved their dogs. They loved having portraits of their dogs with them. But here's what's really interesting. Look how he has himself portrayed. He's looking like the Apollo Belvedere of the Vatican Museums, the Apollo, the god of light, the god of arts. He's indicating in the direction of what looks to be the Temple of the Sibyl back in Tivoli. And in back of him is the head of a very, very famous statue. It was called the Giustiniani Minerva. And that Minerva statue was actually a full body statue. And it was one of the most beloved objects of the Grand Tour. So basically the men of the Grand Tour would sort of all come up, and there's a famous quip from Winckelmann that the hand was whiter than the rest of the body because all of the gentlemen of the Grand Tour came up to kiss her hand. Actually, that wouldn't make it white, it would make it yellow, but that's neither here nor there. Women also had their portraits done, not as many as the men, but this is the portrait of a woman named Frances Lind Brown, who in 1777 had her portrait done by Pompeo Battoni. But I want to get to something else about these portraits, which is this kind of possessive way in which these figures look out over the ancient monuments. So the portrait you see here is this young man is pointing towards the Ariadne of the Vatican Museums. He's in the position of the Apollo Belvedere, which you can see here in the background. His foot is on top of the little fountain. He's inside the Vatican collection with a kind of attitude that it's his. And so there's a certain sense of possessiveness, a sort of sense of possession of these works, which the grand tourists begin to have, that, you know, they are almost as if they're co-owners of these works. Another thing you would do if you were here in the Grand Tour is you made a point of going to the Mosaic Atelier of the Vatican, which didn't look like this. It looks like this today, but it didn't look like this back then. But it's one of the most charming and interesting spots. And that is where you bought the #1 souvenir from the Grand Tour, which is a micro mosaic. Some of these are done as snuff boxes lodged in malachite. You could get a micro mosaic of other famous micro mosaics. That's Pliny's doves that had recently been rediscovered in Tivoli. You could get a whole jewelry set if you wanted and could afford it, or you could have a snuff box with your dog's portrait on it. But again, part of the fun of the Grand Tour was shopping. And then shopping could move into something much, much bigger. than just the mosaics. It also could move quite easily into larger objects. So Gavin Hamilton made a very, very successful career doing stories, painting stories of mythological scenes. But his real success was the antiquities market. And so Gavin Hamilton was the one who eventually made arrangements with the popes so that he could actually excavate sites. So he excavates in Tivoli and he excavates in Ostia. And one of his #1 clients will end up being Charles Townley of England, whose collection basically ultimately forms the basis of the British Museum's collection of ancient sculptures. He was kind of like, Townley was kind of, it's actually interesting, Townley was Catholic. So he was not allowed to work in government, but he was very, very wealthy. And so he went on several trips to Italy and got very interested in these antiquities, purchased many of them and brought them back to England. And upon his death, he donated them to become the basis of the great collection of the British Museum. So he's kind of like the Eli Broad of the age. May Eli rest in peace. You have over here some of the works that this is still in the British Museum today. This is the Cupid bending his bow. And that is one of the stars of the collection, the Venus, that was rediscovered in Ostia and became famous almost immediately and then was shipped out to England. Carnival, of course, was the great, many of the grand tourists tried to be here in time for Carnival because they did love that spirit of the anything goes in Rome. And so as much as the sort of the sunny side of the story that I've been telling you about, there is also a side of the story that is a little bit more disconcerting for the papacy. A group of people who are here for the carnival, who are here for the excesses, for the drinking, for the games, for the fun, but have no interest in the religious aspect. And as a matter of fact, we have certain notes from the diaries that indicate that the behavior on the Grand Tour was generally behavior that perhaps one would not indulge in were one in one's own country. So the young nobleman James Boswell, and this is a part of his diary that we can show in mixed company. He can be very, very, very precise about what he did during his time in Rome, and a lot of it involved the young women of the country. And then there's also this Charles de Brosse, who came from Burgundy in 1740, who kind of walked around looking at the monuments of Rome and kind of with his own little salacious viewpoint. So when he looks at the Teresa of John Lorenzo Bernini, he sort of smirks, oh, if this is divine love, I know it. And I have seen many copies of it in nature. So this idea of kind of taking there's a certain disdain for the mores, the morals of papal Rome, and there's a certain disdain for the religiosity of Rome. As a matter of fact, what many of these people are here to do is to look for the semblances of the ancient Roman Republic. And so they are here because they believe that the secret of a great new society lies in the Republic, which I think pretty good idea. The only problem is that their vision of the Roman Republic is that the Roman Republic was a republic without any religion whatsoever, which isn't true, but this idea that this republic, which was based only on a kind of a worship of the great virtues of humanity, is what is being put forth. And the person who will actually be the most powerful influencer in this mentality is Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Edward Gibbon, who got the idea for the book while he was sitting basically overlooking the Forum. It's that very first picture I showed you by Berotto, looking out over the Forum, and he saw the ruin of such a great society. He wondered to himself, how could this amazing group of people who made these laws, who conquered the world, who made such beautiful buildings, what happened to them? And just as he was thinking this, the bells calling for the Angelus at the Ara church on the top of the Capitoline Hill started to ring, and his thesis fell into place. What went wrong with the Roman Empire was its conversion to Christianity. And this incredibly erudite book with this extraordinary amount of research and this brilliant writing, its fundamental thesis is that everything that went wrong was when the Christians came along. Now, at this point, the Pope's got to get a little worried. And so this is where we see the role of a series of really exceptional popes responding by transforming the Vatican Museums. So we start with Benedict XIV, who was an incredible pope, Benedict XIV from Lambertini, an extraordinary intellectual. He firmly believed that it was absolutely necessary that there be active work in science and mathematics. He endowed the science and mathematics chairs at the Roman University. Already as a cardinal, he said this is a line that he wrote that I think is extraordinary. The duty of a cardinal and the greatest service he can render to the Holy See is to attract learned and honest men to Rome. The Pope has no weapons or army. He has to maintain his prestige by making Rome a model for all other cities. And there it is. The 18th century, everybody is coming to Rome. People who don't really believe in what the Pope is or in the Pope himself, but the Pope is ready for them, because he believes in honest and learned men, and he believes he can show a Rome that is extraordinary. And so he is so admired that actually Voltaire dedicates a book to him, which is very embarrassing for him, but that's another story. So he begins, Clement, actually, he undertakes major projects, which are then picked up by Clement XIV, who will this sort of progression of works in the city. One of the most important things will be new faces for ancient churches. When we go see St. John Lateran and you see this really fabulous facade, but that's not what it looked like in 1700. In 1730, they put up a brand new facade because St. John Lateran, the oldest church in the world, had a crumbling, ramshackle facade. And so they built a new, beautiful travertine facade, which reflected this love of the travertine of the ancient world that the grand tourists were so impressed by, literally giving the church a new face. Santa Maria Maggiore, which had this porch and a beautiful mosaic and sort of mismatched bell towers, but it's a 1600-year-old church in perfect condition. But still, in order to speak to the modern age, St. Mary Major received a new facade, a travertine facade built on these arches, much more in the style of antiquity. I can tell you that it was so popular among the grand tourists that they all went home and designed their bank buildings like this. So there you go. Then, as you moved through Rome, this was the quarter where the grand tourists, particularly the British grand tourists, lived. But this was, they called it the English Ghetto, the area around Piazza di Spagna. And the popes began to intervene very directly there, building the Spanish Steps. To get from the lower area up to the top, you had to climb up two winding dirt paths until 1735, when the papacy decided to negotiating with the King of France, who actually paid for the stairs. They should be called the French stairs, but because the Spanish embassy is at the bottom of the stairs, everybody calls them the Spanish Steps. But this beautiful staircase designed by Francesco de Sanctis, which reaches up to embrace the Church of the Trinity, theatrical, beautiful. And during this month, it was happened to be one nice day of sun, basically in April. So I raced out and got you a picture of the azaleas on the Spanish Steps, which is only in the month of April, they put up azaleas to make the Spanish Steps look like it's spring. And then one of the most interesting things they added was here, because the people of the Grand Tour tended to live in that area around the Spanish Steps because of the water. The Aqua Vergine aqueduct was understood to be the best water in Rome. So what did the popes put in the middle of that area in a way to make them feel surprise and wonder? The Trevi Fountain. The Trevi Fountain, which you can never, ever approach directly. You're going this way, you're going that way. Where is it? I think it's around here somewhere. And then, boom. To create among these people who have been studying ancient Rome and they think they know everything and they're so sure of, oh, I've heard about this and I've heard about that. But in 1762, when the grand tourist walked around the corner And they saw this immense fountain in this small piazza, a fountain based on a triumphal arch. The papacy is so comfortable with the ancient world that we can take a triumphal arch and place it on a building. We show the triumph of water, the figure of Neptune, the figure of Triton standing inside the arch, the qualities of the water, all speaking the language of ancient Rome. You have the rearing horses to talk about the two natures of water, dangerous water that floods and kills, and life-giving water, which in the church always alludes to baptism. And then on the right-hand side, this little broken section, this pseudo-broken section, the work of Niccolo Salvi, the sculptor who built the fountain. It looks like it's falling apart. And what's the message you send to the Grand Tour? No matter how wonderful people build things, no matter how much we think things are going to last, everything human beings do is subject to time. So really a beautiful way of reminding us that yes, these are these glories, but this is only this world for a moment. So the response, the real response took place within the Vatican Museums. The church understood that all of the grand tourists, as I said last week, they're all clamoring at the door, waiting to get into the Vatican Museums. And so the very first thing that Benedict XIV did was to start building a Christian museum. All the grand tourists were here to look at the ancient art. They want to see the Etruscan, they want to see the Roman, the Greco-Roman. And Benedict XIV, to assert the truth of the Christian religion, put together a collection of Christian antiquities. He started to encourage and promote Christian archaeology, which would eventually become the magnificent Pio Cristiano Museum in the Vatican. Then his successor, the Clement, who you saw before, decided to open his collection of antiquities, open the Vatican Museums in a way that we would have organized tourism passing through the Museo Clementinum. So you'd see now the statue of Ariadne, there she is in the background, this wonderful image of the papacy, which is personified as female, which is opening up the world to the world, this art. You have this looking through this this design, this very cleverly designed hallway. So you come in and you see this play on a Roman arch, and then this movement through the old palace, which Julius II had placed, the original collection was placed in a building from the 15th century, put in by Julius II. So the building had been constructed in 1486, and Julius II, when he became Pope, moved his collection into the Vatican. And so you had in the middle two statues, the Nile, the Tigris, the Bramante stair, which he constructed. There was a room with the statue was called Cleopatra when it was discovered under Julius II, and then these rooms of Innocent VIII, which were kind of little extra rooms off to the side. That's what it was when Julius II was there. And then there's a little chapel built by Mantegna. That's what it looked like in the Renaissance. And then along came Pius VI. Giovanangelo Braschi, who was elected in 1775. He was 58 years old when he was elected. He was known as a very handsome and athletic man, and he wore his cassocks a little short because he was known for having a well-turned ankle. He is the man who will give us the Vatican Museums, the modern Vatican Museums. He will redesign what Clement XIV had started, creating the museum that you and I know today ahead of the other museums. He was already known as a handsome cardinal. He was an athletic pope. He was a busy, busy guy, but he designed this brand new structure. The hall of the Rotonda, this rebuilding of after the Pantheon, this room of the Muses, and then the courtyard where the sculptures of the Nile and the Laocoon would be rearranged. How did he pay for it? He had to come up with the money, right? He did two very interesting things. He introduced paper money into the Papal States, and he started a papal lottery. And so the money that he made off the lottery tickets, which we still do in Italy today, went to fund his art projects. And of course, the paper money helped him to change and organize the finances. So yes, the British Museum may have already been in place as of 1753 in the Montague House, but it was a bunch of, curio cabinets in a random room. What did Pius do? Pius, together with his architect, Michelangelo Simonetti, arranged an itinerary through the Vatican Museums, creating rooms that were meant to be purpose-built installations. So you would have a room dedicated to muses. You would walk into his museum, see the statues of the museums excavated together with Gavin Hamilton out of Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli. Look up at Sebastiano Conca's beautiful painting of Apollo and the Nine Muses. And where are you? You're in the Pope's new museum. So everything meant to really make connections. This spectacular room where you see athletes, the room of the Biga. Again, they had just excavated the Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli, finding the bathhouse. So what did they do for the design of the athletes' room? They designed a bathhouse. So over there is the Discobolus in a room that's like the Calidarium of the Tivoli Villa, where you would get you would take the sun and take your bath. And it was a museum open for everyone. Look at the plan. You have men and women. You have children, and apparently you used to be able to bring your dog. Over here, we see again, men, women, children. Look over here. Exotic visitors coming from the Ottoman Empire, this opening of the museum to the world, ultimately able to negotiate peace. Because in 1784, when Gustav III of Sweden came to Rome, it was very awkward for him to meet in an official way Pius VI, because Pius VI and he were at odds religiously, they were at odds virtually everything. But they arranged on January 1st for King Gustav III of Sweden to come to the new museum, the newly opened Vatican Museum. And who did he run into? Pius VI. Pius VI, who again, you see everybody likes to pose like Apollo, took the king around the museum, and they were able to talk, they were able to agree, they were able to discuss things. And that is really what they saw the power of art to be. From Benedict XIV, Clement XIV, Pius VI, these popes invested in art, invested in the city, so that even when we had our differences over politics or over religion, we could still talk together and create a peaceful dialogue through our mutual appreciation of beauty. And that is one of the greatest lessons that the Vatican Museums set into place during this turbulent era of the Enlightenment. And with that, we conclude today's episode.
All right. Well, I can tell you that we have had questions pouring in while you've been talking, so lots to get through. But just a reminder, if you've got a question for Liz, you can go ahead and type it in that Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So first question, you mentioned a little bit earlier that Catholics weren't permitted to work in government. Can you talk a little bit more about why that was, and just a little context?
Yes, I'm sorry, I should have been a little bit more precise. It's the timing makes me rush. I'm talking about England, I'm talking about Great Britain. In England, there were in the 18th century is the era of the battle for laws that will allow Catholics to have some kind of say or role in government. But the anti-Catholic legislation in England in the 18th century prohibited a man like Townley from being able to participate in the government, and this was I can't remember the year that they passed the Act of Toleration, whatever it's called, that allows Catholics to have some kind of political. But this was the situation in England from basically the period of the Reformation up until the 19th century.
Can we talk a little bit more about Edward Gibbon and some of his theories on what went wrong with the Roman Empire? So prior to the arrival of Christianity in Rome, what were people doing? What was the prominent religion? What was the sort of pre-Christian situation?
So sorry, this is going to be a little reductive. The religion in Rome there were many, many, many different religions in Rome. But what happens at the rise of the empire is that there becomes a state religion, which is embodied in the person of the Roman emperor. But Rome is very open to other religions, just so long as they don't in any way conflict with the person, the deification of the state, i.e. emperor. So Rome had all kinds of Eastern cults. There was actually a thriving Jewish community from the 2nd century BC. There are Mithrans, there are Far Eastern cults, the cult of Attis, the cult of Isis, the cult of, but the established religion in Rome is a religion dedicated to various gods, brought in by the government to oversee and supervise different elements of Roman life. And according to, because when you start to look at this after a while, it starts to look very silly, and there's a general belief and there's a general cynicism about religion that happens towards the end of the Republic. But that is read by the people of the Enlightenment as the Romans don't believe in gods anymore. The Romans have moved beyond the concept of God, and they're moving towards this idea of human virtues and philosophies. That's not correct. The Romans are actually, they remain very religious. There are people who are more cynical, the more cynical about religion, but the Romans remain really fundamentally very religious people. So this is not true what they're saying. But at the end of the day, what Gibbon says is that when the Christians come along, and this is a religion that embraces suffering, a religion that does not, it doesn't give the Romans the wherewithal, the courage, the pride, and the aggression to fight back from the invasions, et cetera, et cetera. So it is the inherent weakness of Christianity that brings about the weakness in the Roman Empire that eventually will see it fall. And that was the general idea.
So changing gears just a little bit, we have a question about the antiques market. So one of our audience members wants to know, can you talk a little bit about Thomas Hope, the dilettanti, the people who are sort of purchasing antiques, and how all of that is working?
It is actually a really, really fascinating subject. I actually have next to me a really interesting book that was put out by Yale called Digging and Dealing in 18th Century Rome. And it's by Claire Hornsby and another author, Ilaria Bignamini. But it's very, very interesting. The market question on antiquities is fascinating. Gavin Hamilton is only one. There are numerous other people who settle in Rome, and they work in a kind of, it's not really a traffic, but they work in the business of antiquities. So there are excavation projects going on. You buy a license from the papacy. And you dig. In the case of Gavin Hamilton, they work out a really interesting arrangement where Pius VI gets first dibs on what comes out. And that's how the Vatican Museum fills very rapidly when it's being rebuilt. But Gavin Hamilton has the possibility of selling these works, and he makes a great deal of money out of it. And a number of other agents, as it were, come to Rome and make similar arrangements. So there's a very, when we come back to this subject 2 lectures on, we're going to find that the church reverses its opinion about sort of letting antiquities leave at this rate. And there'll be a very, very different attitude come the early 1800s. But that period of the 1700s, it was very common to find these dilettantes, as you were saying, art lovers who were looking to buy an antiquity that they could bring back. And there are tons of them. Gavin Hamilton sold them not just to Townley and to Pius VI, but, you know, if you could afford it, you could have it.
I think this next question might preview a little bit some of our discussion for next week, but one of our attendees observes that she's very surprised that women were allowed to see all of these classical nude male Greco-Roman statues. And so is there any issue around propriety or appropriateness or kind of social expectations? Is this, what's the sort of best of society saying at this point?
You are absolutely right. And yes, you're both right, because it is next week we get to women on the grand tour, which is of course my pet passion. So we'll be talking a lot about women, their role in the grand tour, but just as a kind of preview, yes, there are issues, and that is the reason just to get it out, that's why we have the fig leaves. The reason for the fig leaves is that. And so it's to save women from uncomfortable situations with, you know, lots and lots and lots of naked guys in the gallery.
That's fantastic. Okay, so next question is about sort of how the urban fabric of Rome changes. So you know, you detailed all of the shifts that are happening around hotel building and tourism and people coming in and new construction projects. Who's doing all these jobs? Are there a ton of people coming into Rome? Does the population grow? Is it sort of repurposing sectors that have been doing other things? How does that work?
No, there's dramatic influx in population. So this is something that the papacy likes, because it starts to create employment, and to have these wealthy families that have generally been kind of living in their estates outside the city begin to move into the city, because they see that there's work to be done and there's business to be done, is very important. So they're bringing people in from people are attracted by the possibility of work on the construction of these projects. It has a lot more. There's a lot more to it. This requires the city will require new water movement. The infrastructure needs a lot of work. So, for example, if you have specialists and people like in places like Naples or let's say Venice, where the economy is slowed and there's not much work, then the fact that there's a lot going on in Rome and that people are obviously, you know, giving out jobs in Rome, they will draw people to Rome during that period. The impact on the urban design of Rome, of the Grand Tour, is enormous. But I think one of the most interesting things about it is that in the great age of pilgrimage, so in the 17th century and in the 15th, 16th century, they're very interested in building straight lines. They want the roads to be straight lines and very easy to see and understand. In the late 18th and 19th century, they want to surprise you. And so you keep kind of running into things that are a little bit, wow, I didn't expect that. So this kind of dual aspect of the design of the city.
We've got time for just one more question, and I think it's a good follow-on from the previous one, which is, with all of these folks coming into Rome as part of the Grand Tour, how did they handle basic issues like sanitation and water supply? I mean, was it messy? Was it okay? Who was responsible for figuring out some of those solutions?
It's pretty messy. It is pretty messy, and as a matter of fact, I almost took a picture of one the other day. We have all kinds of old inscriptions regarding what legislation of where you can throw your garbage in the street, but they're like from 1740, and so like you can't throw your dead animals here. You can't throw no. Unfortunately, the Tiber takes the brunt of sewage and waste. The city mostly functions with chamber pots, so no, it's not. There are places that don't smell very nice.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. I know you mentioned it, but do you want to just give a quick plug for
Yes.
our lecture next week? Perfect.
Absolutely. I meant to make a slide for it. We will be, next week, we will be talking about the question you keep asking, women on the Grand Tour. And as a matter of fact, we're going to move not just to the women of the Grand Tour, but we're going to start talking about the Americans on the Grand Tour. So we're spread out of the 18th century and start looking at the 19th century. And you are going to meet some of the most interesting women who came to this city. It's going to be terrific.
Wow, I can't wait. Well, don't miss it. It'll be the same time next week. And of course, if you do miss any of Liz's lectures, or if you'd like to go back and rewatch part of one, you can always find them on our YouTube channel. That's California Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museum. You can actually also always find a live stream on our Facebook page as well. And with that, it just is left to me to thank all of you for being here, to thank Liz, and to thank all of the folks who work so hard in the Vatican Museums to preserve and protect those phenomenal collections. So all of our work as patrons goes to support their efforts, and that's the restoration of everything from statuary to tapestries to mosaics to incredible paintings and other antiquities. And part of our work is to make sure that, just like the grand tourists who visited Rome previously, that those treasures are around for generations and hopefully centuries to come. So if you'd like to support the work of the patrons, you can make a gift at any time at californiapatrons.org/donations. And with that, thank you so much to Liz. Thanks to all of you, and we'll see you next time.